Going to start by asking children a question. Who can answer this question? There was one disciple of Jesus who doubted when, even after Jesus had risen from the dead, he said, I'm not going to believe it unless I can see the nail marks, put my hand in his side. Who was that? Anyone know who that is? Want to try? Yep. Thomas, spot on. Thank you. Okay, so Thomas the doubter. But we sometimes have a bit of a hard case on this guy because Thomas was also the guy we learnt back in chapter 11, verse 16, that he is the guy who was ready to stand up for Jesus, even give his life to Jesus, for Jesus, ready to die. He wasn't just a doubter, and yet he had questions. And what we're seeing here, and this is something for not only children, all of us, there's nothing wrong with asking questions. We're allowed to have things we're not sure of, we don't understand, and Jesus encourages this right here, as we're going to see, that Thomas is asking a question, and Jesus doesn't fob him off, but gives him an answer. Pick it up with me in John 14, verse 4, where Jesus says, you know the way to the place where I'm going. And Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And it's a fair question. How can we know? Here's Thomas. He's just found out in the previous chapter that we learned that Jesus said, I'm going away, and where I'm going you can't come. And then he says, but it's okay because I'm going to give you some rooms. I'm going to prepare some rooms for you. And Thomas is thinking to himself, well, heck, I don't even know where these rooms are. How am I supposed to know the way? Now, what is the answer? Why shouldn't Thomas have already known this? Let me use a little illustration here. If you try to immigrate to a country, any country, they have rules. You can't just waltz into a country and become a citizen. They have requirements, very stringent requirements in many cases. You know, visa processes, all this sort of residency requirements, all these sort of things, and even then you can get rejected, right? In most cases you do. But for the Jewish person, it just happens that unlike any other country in the world, if you're a Jew and you've never lived in Israel, you can take your first trip to Israel, rock up to the consulate and say, how do I get citizenship here in Israel? And they'll say, you've already got it. We'll give it to you right away. No requirements, no nothing. You don't have, that's it. Unlike any other country in the world, citizenship on arrival for any Jew, even though they've never lived in Israel. Citizenship in heaven is a little bit like that. Even though you've never been there, and that's what Jesus is getting at with Thomas here. By virtue of a relationship with Jesus, by knowing Jesus, in this life, you automatically have citizenship in heaven. You already know the way. How do you already know the way? Because if you know Jesus, you already know the way, because he is the way. And that's, of course, what he says in verse 6. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, that statement right there is the big one that offends all of your non-Christian friends and family. How can you be so arrogant as to say that Jesus is the only way? What about all the other ways? And the first thing you need to say to them, here's your first evangelism tip for the day, is you've got to say to them first, it's not my idea. It's not that I think Jesus is the only. I didn't come up with this. It's not the church's idea. The church didn't just come up with this. It's actually Jesus' idea. He is the one who says, I am the way. And yet people will still tell you that it's still arrogant to say, what about all the other ways to God? And here's your second evangelism tip for the day. When people say, how can you be so arrogant? How can you say there's only one way to God? what you've got to do is ask them this. Do you know any other way? They go, well, yes, of course there are other ways. What about all the other religions? No. Do you know of any other way that's ever been offered to take away our sin? Well, don't all the other religions? No, they don't actually, as a matter of fact. See, this is not as complicated as you think. All the religions agree on there's a problem, and that problem is if you've done something wrong, anything wrong, there's a price to pay. Whether it's karma, reincarnation, judgment, hell, they all have hell, there's a price to pay. Have a look at the way the Buddhist scriptures describe it from a section on karma. The Dhammapada, that means the teachings of the Buddha. Let's hear what the Buddha says. If it's suffering you fear, if it's suffering you dislike, just do no evil deeds at all, for all to see or secretly. Even a flight in the air cannot free you from suffering after the deed which is evil has once been committed. You've done something wrong? You're going to pay. According to the Buddhists, you could fly into the air, you're not going to get away from it. There's a price to pay. Now, of course, the hope of the other religions of the world is that maybe you could do enough good stuff to outweigh your bad stuff, but even that's disputed. If you go deeper into the Buddhist scriptures, there's a section called Doctrinal Disputes, where it's actually disputed whether there's any such thing as good deeds being able to outweigh bad deeds. And that's kind of natural, really, because it's ingrained in every one of our hearts that, of course, good deeds can't outweigh bad deeds. We know that. We know that. Everybody knows that, except when it comes to religion, they think it's somehow going to be different. But everybody knows it in real life here on this earth that you cannot, no matter how many good things you've done. And we've looked at these sort of things before. It's not just the murderer or the bank robber, but right down to the smallest infringement. The parking ticket. I think I mentioned before, the parking ticket. There's the guy, topping out your parking ticket, and you run up to him and say, but officer, I've done a lot of good parking. I park good all the time except this one time. Can't you forgive me? Isn't there any forgiveness? And he says, yes, I forgive you. Now here's your ticket. Right? It doesn't matter how many times you do good stuff. In fact, it's quite outrageous to think that someone could get off in a public arena because they're some high-profile person or they've done all this good or something. We know that it's actually corrupt if someone were to get off for doing a lot of good stuff. Same principle in the religions of the world, the karma, the reincarnation. There's a price to pay. Even in Islam. Now, Islam does actually have this concept of weighing good deeds and bad deeds. If you read the Quran, just open your Qurans at Surah 23, verse 102 and 103. You see right there, it's got their scales that Allah's going to weigh on the day of judgment to say which do your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, but how much good is enough? Because any devout Muslim will tell you they have no certainty that they're going to heaven according to Islam. Because how much is enough? How much does it take? How many good deeds does it take to outweigh? The Quran says in Surah 46, verse 8 and 9, even Muhammad has no assurance of heaven. Why? Because how much is enough? And the hope, of course, is that Allah will be a little bit of a shonky judge and just turn a blind eye to a few bad deeds that you've done, overlook a bit of evil, overlook a bit of wrong. In other words, the hope is that Allah will be a corrupt judge, a judge who will not bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing. And hopefully, in the minds of the Muslim, that God will be corrupt enough to let my sin off. So all the religions are agreeing with a problem. You do something wrong, there's a price to pay. And what are they trying to do? Well, in their own minds, they're trying to help us to stop making the problem worse. So they give us all these do's and don'ts, all these things you've got to do and all these things you're not supposed to do to stop making the problem worse. That's great. They give you rules. The Buddhist scriptures have 10 commandments as well. And some of them we recognise. No stealing, no lying, no murder, no sex before marriage. And then there's other ones they have that we're not so familiar with. No singing or dancing or worldly entertainment or perfume or jewellery. Just looking out to see who's wearing any jewellery today. And no sleeping on a bed higher than 8 inches off the floor. Now, I'm not sure what the reason why that's a sin, unless, of course, you have a habit of falling out of bed, maybe because of your safety feature. But the point is that these are trying to help us to stop making the problem worse. Don't do these things, or you're going to cop a worse karma, a worse hell, a worse judgment. That's trying to make the problem worse. But what about a solution? What about a way to take away our sin? Not even offered. This is not complicated. This is not like we've got to choose through many ways. No one else. You kids ever have people say to you, how can you just believe Jesus is the only way? You ask them this. Has anyone else ever died on a cross? Has anyone else ever take an eternal judgment in themselves for me? There's no one else has ever offered a way. Not just there is no other way. There's no one else who's even offered a way. It's not that complicated. And that's why Jesus says in verse 6, let's read it again. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus says he's not only the way, he is the truth. Boy, that is really cutting home today. What is truth? And where do you find it? We're in what we call a postmodern culture. That means one of the features of postmodernism is that through our education system, through our culture, through our universities, there's no such thing as truth. It's up for grabs. It's all relative. What's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me, and it's the same in religion or anything else. It's just what works for you and what you feel or what you believe. I feel there's a cup on the table there, but you might feel it's a ham sandwich, whatever. So it's all a matter of what you perceive. That's how we determine truth. Now, they say the same thing to you in regards to issues of faith. Your way to God is what you feel, and other people have their other ways, and theirs is just as true, because they say, and this is one of the hard things of postmodernism, is there is no such thing as truth. There are no absolutes. There are no absolutes. Now, what do you say? Here's your next evangelism tip for today. What do you say when someone says to you, there's no absolutes? You've got to say to them, are you absolutely sure about that? You see, it's a self-defeating nonsense to say there's no such thing as truth, or no such thing as absolutes, or no such thing as absolute truth, because that's a truth statement. So if there's no such thing as absolute truth, I don't have to listen to you when you tell me there's no such thing as absolute truth. It's self-defeating, isn't it? It's nonsense. And if I don't have to listen to you when you say there's no such thing as truth, because there's no such thing as truth, then maybe you're wrong and there is such a thing as truth. But how would we know what that truth is? And unless we know for certain, we are just guessing. What is truth? Pontius Pilate asked that. What is truth? Because if there is such a thing as truth, maybe there is a cup on that table and not a ham sandwich. And maybe whether you feel like you're a woman when you're born a man or vice versa or whatever, that there is such a thing that defines beyond what I feel what is truth. So when people say, bring these things, and you will hear it, you're going to hear it a lot more too. Whatever you believe about God is true for you, but it's not necessarily true for others. They've got their truth. How do we handle this? Well, we've got to handle it this way. By asking in this question, by what authority do you make that statement? By what authority do you make that statement? Where did you get this from? Where did you get this idea from? Do you know all things? Are you the supreme being who could tell us all knowledge as to what is and what isn't? The fact of the matter is, we are all fallible, finite, limited human beings who don't know everything. And, we've got all these different opinions, different religions, and then there are the philosophers. See, the philosophers, they stand above religion. They haven't always, by the way. We go back to the ancient philosophers, the Platos and the Socrates and the Aristotle. These guys did believe in God. But the modern philosopher stands above religion. He generally has got nothing to do with belief in God or anything like that. But they've figured out the true meaning and figured out the true truth behind, or the fact that there's a lack of truth, whatever it is. They've figured it out. They stand above religion. But philosophy is actually just religion by stealth. It's the same principle as religious people, finite, limited, fallible, imperfect human beings grappling with the meaning of life, trying to figure out the meaning of life, or to say there is no meaning, whatever it might be they conclude on. It's just human beings, limited, making these, the philosophers would say they're making more educated guess than you silly religious people. They're standing above religion, but they're actually just the same thing, dressed up in different garb, just limited, finite human beings, reaching up to the great unknown of life. They'll say stuff like, we've got, they've understood the condition of man and the processes of thinking and so on, and they know more than we do why we become religious and all this sort of stuff. And you should ask them, have you checked with the Martians on the other side of the universe to see if they agree with you? They're the ones who started this whole thing off, remember? That theory. Well, the point is that that's a nonsense as well, because unless you know everything, unless you've been to every part of this universe, we're 99% sure that there's no God in the universe. We checked out the universe and we figured it out. What if God's hiding in the other 1%? Do you know everything? And unless you know everything, you couldn't possibly know truth, who God is, if there's a God or if there isn't a God or any other such thing. At least in Buddhism, we have an open acknowledgement that it's not, their religion does not come from an all-knowing being who's revealed truth to them, because there is no God in Buddhism. So the Buddhist is acknowledging that it comes from man's personal spiritual experience and knowledge and whatever it is. Bottom line, it's admitting essentially that it's man-made. But the other philosophies and religions are not admitting that. They're saying we've got some great knowledge. Hinduism has no founder or leader who claims absolute knowledge and truth. Now in Islam you have Muhammad, the founder of Islam, but he never claimed to be God or to know everything. He never claimed to have a personal connection, relationship with God. He claimed that he had a visitation from an angel from God. Mind you, when that first happened, he wasn't sure whether it was a demonic source or whether it was really an angel of God. Obviously, he came to believe it was an angel of God. But the point is, he didn't personally know God. He certainly didn't claim to be God himself. But whether it's the philosophers or the religious people or just the average person who's reckoned, I think God is this or I think God is this, the bottom line is we're just human beings. We're fallible. We're able to know. We are not able to know everything. We're relying on our spiritual experiences or personal knowledge, which is limited. And if that's all we've got to go on, then the postmodernists are right. There is no such thing as truth. It's just human guessing and opinions. How can you know anything when you can't even trust anyone anymore if you could before? You can't trust the mainstream media to be telling the truth. You can't trust the internet, little guy media. They're just as big a liars as the mainstream media. Now we've got AI, artificial intelligence. You can't even trust something coming out of someone's mouth that it's really that person saying what they're saying. How could you ever know what truth is when we're in this world filled with lies? And we're liars ourselves. There's no hope. Unless God himself, who does know everything, who has been in every part of the universe, comes down and shows up in person and tells us. That is what we've been looking at through John's Gospel. That in the beginning was the Word who was God, who became flesh. And we've heard from Jesus' own words the amount of times that he has said, indeed, he is that God who came down and showed up in person. Just as it was predicted from the Old Testament, we read from Isaiah 9:6, the Son will be born who will be called Mighty God. That is what we see in John's Gospel, where Jesus comes and smashes to smithereens postmodernism, philosophy, religious attempts to reach up to God and find God. He doesn't just come to merely teach what truth is. Let's read it again in verse 6. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth. The truth. That is the only place we can find truth in certainty in this world, because we're all imperfect and the perfect God has revealed himself. I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. The only one qualified to say there is truth is God himself. And only God himself knows everything. And that's what Jesus is saying. For all of that he is built up to and will continue on in this gospel about claiming to be God, he lets it slip again in here. Look at verse 9. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So we've got to be clear to our non-Christian friends and family who ask these questions and say, what about other ways? Let's say to them, it's not complicated. It's not so difficult. There's only one person who's ever walked the face of this earth, who's claimed to be God come down in person, the truth, and had it taken seriously on a worldwide scale. There are no other takers. And there's no other ones who are even offering a way. It's not that complicated. Jesus, if we had time to go into it, can explain the existence of why we have the other religions. But the other religions can't explain Jesus. They can't accommodate. They try to. You go to the Buddhist or to the Hindu and they will try to accommodate. Yes, he's one of the gods. That doesn't work with what Jesus claimed about himself. Yet Jesus can explain the existence of the other religions because we are compulsive idolaters. We want to believe in something, but we don't want to have to believe in one who would tell us, you're so bad I had to go to a cross and die for you. Oh, get away from me. I'm a good person. Give me my religion on my terms. But if God has come down in person and revealed himself as the truth, then we would expect some evidence, some supernatural fireworks. And that's what Jesus points his followers to in verse 11. Read it with me. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves. So here's Jesus saying, just take back a look at what's been going on over the last 3 years. Jesus' miracles so impacted the ancient world. It was not just the disciples, it was the guys who were trying to kill him who admitted that he was doing the miracles. The Pharisees were openly admitting that he did the miracles because they couldn't deny it. So what did they do? They tried to explain it away. He's doing it by the power of the devil. And that's why we see there is no record anywhere of anyone, enemy or friend, or anywhere in between, who denied Jesus' miracles. And that's why you have one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament was actually a former enemy of Christians. The Apostle Paul was the guy who was going around trying to round up Christians to be murdered, and then he becomes the great Apostle Paul. How did that work? Because he saw the evidence of the risen Jesus, the miracles themselves, as Jesus puts it here. In fact, the miracles of Jesus are so powerfully embedded in the historical record. They not only were not denied by the Pharisees, but even in the later Jewish writings, the Talmud openly acknowledges that Jesus performed miracles. Now you go, hang on a minute, how does that work? Why would they admit that Jesus performed? Well, they couldn't deny it, of course. So how do they explain it? He did it by the power of sorcery or black magic. Notice they confirm that Jesus, the historical record confirms, even from the enemies, Jesus performed the miracles. They just try to explain it away. Now, if Jesus is the truth, we'd expect that kind of evidence, but we'd also expect that his teaching of the truth would have some sort of impact, change, that would turn the world upside down. If it's really God who's come into the world to proclaim truth, where's the evidence of this truth impacting people? Well, maybe sometimes we get so close to it we miss it. You know, Jesus' teaching was not done in a corner. It was not some cult who gained a few followers or some religion that's confined to a culture like Hinduism is largely to India, or Shinto is to Japan or whatever, but something that's had a worldwide impact. And I don't mean worldwide because some internet YouTuber has a few followers, I mean real impact in history and across the world. Now, I've already said 1 in 3 people who walk the face of this earth claim to have been impacted by the teaching of Jesus. Claim to be followers, whether they really are or not. At least you see that impact. In fact, even if we take, that's 1 in 3 people who walk the face of the earth. But then if you get 1/5 of people who follow Islam, in the Quran that Jesus is mentioned many more times than Muhammad. 93 verses of the Quran speak of Jesus, and Muhammad's only mentioned 4 times in the Quran. In other words, skewed as it is, that's why so many Muslims become open to wanting to know more about Jesus. But the point I'm making here is that the world has been impacted from this one who came into the world 2,000 years ago. Oh yeah, he says he's God. Well, take a look at the last 2,000 years. Half the world is going to stop next week to celebrate, whether they're thinking about it or not, whether they're blinded by stuffing themselves with Easter eggs. They're still going to be stopping at the time where Jesus came into the world and proved it by rising from the dead. If you think about all these people who are complaining about, oh yeah, Christianity is dead, oh yeah, look, religion is the cause of all the world's problems. Those same people are still basking in the benefits of the truth of Jesus. What do I mean? I'm going to give you a small excerpt from a review done on Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and it's by an atheist called Shannon Love. Just read this with me. As an atheist myself, I look forward to Dawkins weighing in on the subject of religion from the perspective of an evolutionary theorist in his new book. Imagine my shock, even horror, to discover that Dawkins' book is trite, facile, and just, plain dumb. The most immediate flaw in the book is Dawkins' uncritical acceptance of the idea that religion causes people to make worse decisions than does an atheistic worldview. Empirically, it isn't true, and anyone with even a passing knowledge of history can discern the real pattern. So the author then goes on, now here's an atheist, mind you, gives a rundown on how foolish it was for Dawkins to be using the Crusades as an example, when in fact in the Crusades, if everyone was nominally religious, how can you say it was a religious motivation? It was a political motivation based on the fact, and rightly so, that 2/3 of the Christian world had been taken over by Islam, and it was a political military response, not a religious response. But then he went on to highlight the positive roles of religion, and that's my point that I'm really bringing up here. People like Richard Dawkins, and for that matter, all of the Western world, basks in the benefits of Jesus as the truth and the way that the truth who came into the world has impacted the world, and they bask in it and they receive all the benefits and then turn around and criticise and try to eliminate Christ from the culture. What do I mean by that? I'm going to list you a few things here that we just, as Westerners, just think they just happen and people just came up with a good idea. And the answer is no, you're wrong. They came from Christianity. Let me list a few things. The concept of hospitals. Where did that come from? public education, separation of church and state. That's a Christian concept. You go to a Muslim country or anything, or communist country, or most of the countries of the world, they have no concept of a separation of church and state. It's a Christian concept. So therefore, democracy as we know it. The abolition of slavery, the abolition of child labour, the origin of aid organisations, the idea of love your neighbour as yourself, protection of animals. Who do you think founded the RSPCA? English clergymen. Now, all these things were started by, not by just nominally religious people, but by people who would be labelled today as Bible bashers, who wanted to live out the teaching of the Christ they believed in and were motivated from the Scriptures to start these kinds of things. The Protestant work ethic, we just kind of think, the Western world just happens to be the most prosperous. It's just a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's because those countries originally were more affected by the truth of Jesus. So what do I mean when I say people are just basking in all the benefits of the Western world? They actually think, we got this ourselves, we just made it. No, you didn't. It came from the truth impacting into this world. It came from Jesus as the truth. And how did Jesus communicate this truth? Well, we see in this very gospel, Jesus gives his guarantee to his disciples. Not only does he teach them, but he says, I'm going to go away, I'm sending my Holy Spirit to guide you into all truth. These are among the guys who wrote down what we're reading now in our Bible. In other words, this, like this Gospel of John, John was there. The Bible is God showed up in person and told us where to find truth in his word. It's not just a church idea. It's not just a Christian idea. It's Jesus' idea. So let's wrap up now thinking about this. How can we know truth? Doesn't matter if you're devoutly religious, an atheistic philosopher, the smartest person in the world. We're limited, we're fallible, we're imperfect. We don't know anything for certain from ourselves unless God shows up in person and tells us. That is the message of who Jesus is, and he's proved it. He's risen from the dead. He is alive. We don't have to grapple. And it's not about what I feel, what I think. We can't know anything unless the truth shows up in person. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth